our clients are not tech companies. They're sort of everyone else who needs to use tech to do their business. So they may, there are one's a manufacturing company or an engineering company, or they're media companies. There's a lot of different types of companies, but their business is tech enabled, but they're not a tech company. So in their case, it's almost the opposite of what you described, is they're quite good at business and sales and marketing and finance, but they're not good at tech. They're not, they don't have that DNA. And so what we found is our biggest value add is in helping companies scale. So not really from 0 to 1, but much more from, some to a lot. Our clients, I would say the sweet spot, probably, 75 to $100 million revenue on up, where our biggest client right now is about 6 billion in revenue. So
Today's guest is Anthony Bay. Anthony is the founder and CEO of Techquity. Anthony, it's wonderful to have you here. Please introduce yourself, the company, and tell us what Techquity does.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Pleased to be here as well. So Techquity is a group of very senior tech people, product and engineering leaders from the top companies that you might imagine: Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, Google, as well as, a number of others. And we help investors and CEOs basically navigate tech execution and challenge at scale. So we're an advisory firm, and we invest human capital, if you will, instead.
Got it. Okay. There's a lot we can unpack there, I think.
Yes, I'm sure. Yeah.
Well, so what led you to start Techquity?
It's both a good story, and I think in hindsight, not surprising. So I got to a place in my career where I realized that I wanted to stay involved, I wanted to stay relevant, I wanted to stay engaged, I want to be part of teams, I want to work on projects that matter with people I care about. And the options that you have to do that, if you come from the world I came from, you can stay in one of the big tech companies and be a cog in a wheel, well paid cog in a wheel, but you're cog in a wheel. Or you can join a private company, VC funded or something like that, but you're part of the executive staff, and you're part of the leadership team, and you're going to need to be all in for as long as it takes. Those jobs are all consuming if you're going to be successful. Or people decide, I'm going to try to be a consultant. I'm going to try to be an advisor. I'm going to try to be independent. And the latter is very hard to do alone. So you get to this kind of inflection point in life where where I'll speak for me, but it turned out that this resonated with a lot of other people, where you're like, I don't want to stop. I want to keep going. I have the flexibility to be able to make some choices about my professional life. But what do I do? And so the premise of Techquity is really to be a collective of people like that, people who've got to a place in their career where they've had success. They've built the kind of a resume and experience that people would love to have access to, but they don't want to go work for those people. So essentially, we're happy to help, we're happy to work with people, but we're looking for a different life model. And so I found, in talking to people that I knew, and I hate to say my network, but among people that I knew from this world, that resonated with a lot of people. And so that was the genesis, if you will, of, if you on the product side, if you think about the people as the product. And on the other side, the more I got into it, the more I realized that most investors, whether most private investors, so private capital, private equity, and even venture firms, for the most part, they're not tech. They're not strong tech background. They're smart investors. They're good at what they do, but they're not tech. And so they tend to have a tech person on the group, a tech operating partner or a tech partner, but it's pretty thin. And on the company side, most CEOs are good business people, but not necessarily strong technical people. And so the challenge, because every business needs to be a great tech company in some way, the challenge is, how do you do that if you don't have that expertise? How do you know who to hire? How do you know, why am I, when things aren't right? So the working backwards from the customer side was, how do we help CEOs trying to build companies, especially ones that are of a certain size? And how do we help their investors by bringing the expertise of this group of people together? So that's a very long-winded version, but that was the genesis of that kind of two-sided.
Yeah, that's super important. I personally have been in the startup space for the last 5 years, and I've seen how there's a lot of good tech and there are a lot of founders that are really tech oriented, at least in my experience. But when it comes to other things like sales and marketing, that's maybe where they're not as knowledgeable and where there's a gap. And that's where someone like myself would come in and fill it. When you're looking at engagements and you're looking at potential customers or opportunities beyond product, what are the other gaps that you try to fill? And what are some of the stages of companies that you prefer to work with?
Sure. So the majority, a little bit different than I think where you've found your primary business. Our clients are not tech companies. They're they're sort of everyone else who needs to use tech to do their business. So they may, there are one's a manufacturing company or an engineering company or they're media companies. There's a lot of different types of companies, but their business is tech enabled, but they're not a tech company. So in their case, it's almost the opposite of what you described, is they're quite good at business and sales and marketing and finance, but they're not good at tech. They're not, they don't have that DNA. And so what we found is our biggest value add is in helping companies scale. So not really from 0 to 1, but much more from, some to a lot. Our clients, I would say the sweet spot, probably, 75 to $100 million revenue on up, where our biggest client right now is about 6 billion in revenue. So they're places where they're making big investments. They have a lot at risk, but they don't have the internal expertise to do a good job. So a lot less startups and much more, I would say, more mature or later stage companies.
That so that probably works well from your corporate experience in
Yeah.
adapting it to to the customers that you work with. But what's it like going from being in a, like you mentioned, being a kind of a cog in a wheel at a very large organization to now being the CEO of a small, like 20-person company?
So I've actually done all of the above. Before I went to work, I started a company when I was in my early 20s doing digital, whatever, a long time ago. And that didn't work. And so I got a real, if you will, a real job because I had two little kids and I needed all the things you need if you have two little kids, a little more stability. And so I spent a lot of my career in big companies. I've been in startups, I've done startups, I've been in mid-sized companies, I've been on boards of public companies. So I've actually been across the whole spectrum. And so I'm comfortable, I was able to get comfortable with each of them. The difference in this case is we're not trying to build a product company. If you want to build a product company, you really have to get to scale. And in our case, this is it's more consulting model, even though we don't like to think of ourselves as consultants. So it's different. That would be something I would say that the bigger change has been less about the size thing and more about I spent my life in primarily product or service companies and being in this kind of more professional service. It's definitely different.
Yeah, yeah, I can see that. Um, and one of the things that I really liked about your background is your experience with AI. And of course, it's like the biggest buzzword anyone can think of right now. So when it comes to AI and your existing customers, how are you integrating that in? Because you mentioned like manufacturing customers, and I think a lot of people don't think of manufacturing and AI in some senses, but some people do definitely, like they can go really well together. So, that's just one example, but how are you integrating that into the business and at what point?
Well, it's a great question. I think I've been both fortunate and enough to have seen different transitions in my life, tech transitions. I bought up an Apple II in the early days of PCs and networking and internet. I was quite involved in a lot of that and then mobile. And so there you see these fundamental platform shifts and how eventually they impact everything. So AI is, in simplest terms, in my view, AI is two things. One of them is it's another one of those. So it will become ubiquitous in the same sense that, you might, when the internet, in the mid 90s, people were like, why do I care about the internet? I make X. Well, the answer is because ultimately it becomes the way you do many things, the way you communicate, the way you sell, the way you interact, the way you get information. And so I think there's a threat of AI, which is another fundamental platform shift. People will build applications in the broadest possible sense with AI as a tool that didn't exist before. So you can solve really interesting problems in very different ways without getting into the specifics here. As you said, there's a lot on AI. The difference with AI is none of those other things had what I would call agency. So you were dealing with a technology, not a technology that had its own, I hate to say intelligence, but for the purpose of this, yeah, intelligence. I mean, you wouldn't give something a task and expect they were very task oriented. So on one hand, it's another version of a wave. And in the other, it's a very different type of wave. So as is true with all of these, I think the most important thing for any company is to get on the learning curve, experiment, and not wait. There's no benefit to being last. And you really don't know how things will make sense. And so what the applications will be. So that's the biggest thing with this, as in any of these other things, is you need to be on the curve. You need to be learning. I don't think, all the debates about does it replace people and not. I mean, people love the drama, and those things may happen, but I think the deeper question is, how can I use this to do what I do better? How can I serve customers better? How can I make people more productive? How can I invent new products? And as Techquity, we have a Substack, and so we've been writing about this. We have, partners with pretty significant AI expertise. One of them basically built and ran Amazon's Rufus, which is the shopping AI part of Amazon. Another was one of the main people in Apple Intelligence, ran all the edge intelligence. We have people who have a lot of deep experience. And I think the main lesson from all of those is kind of similar to what I said, which is you need to be in the game. You need to be in the game. You need to learn and kind of go from there. So I try to stay away from the existential discussions and stay on the more pragmatic ones. And the other thing is you can't predict. It's impossible to accurately predict the outcomes other than things will be different.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And you bring up something interesting earlier when you're talking about, am I saving time? Like, am I making something good? Like, I think these are some of the questions that people ask when they're building product, especially now with AI. Like, there seems to be a product for everything. And sometimes I come across these products and I'm like, what does that do? Like, does that actually help people? And it makes me think about product market fit, which is, there could be a whole conversation around that. But I'm curious though, like, when do you think companies realize product market fit?
So in some senses, there are things that are very much the same, and then there's others I would say that are different. And I'll try to say what I mean. So one of the things happens in tech companies in particular, but not exclusively, is people get confused about what's a feature, what's a product, and what's a company. And that I think is really important. So sometimes people find something and go, well, if it did this, that would be very cool. And you're like, yeah, but these other companies could just add that as a feature. So there's really nothing it's a cool feature, all right, but it's not a thing. And then in other cases, you have things which might be an interesting product, but are hard to build a business around. And so one of the reasons I think you see a lot of high degree of failure in tech startups is the confusion about how many of these things can build good companies versus how many of these things are, building something that's not defensible. Because the challenge with anything you build is someone can copy, not anything, but that's one of the biggest things is what's your moat. So there's that question of finding users and finding fit doesn't mean that you have a business. But you touched on something like that earlier. The other thing though, I think, is the principles are relatively straightforward. Is if you have zeroed in on something where you're helping people solve a problem that they'll pay for, and they'll pay for in a way that, lets you make money, and there's enough of them to matter. There's a different product market fit for a dog grooming store in a small town is different than product market fit for somebody who's trying to build something you sell to lots of people. So it's all relative to the business you're trying to do. And I think everything doesn't have to be a home run to be a good thing. I think that's the other thing is, people tend to, so measuring properly is the right thing. So the reason I said that is depending on what you're setting out to do, product market fit is specific to, to the goals you're trying to accomplish. But ultimately, if you can't find people who think what you're doing is valuable enough, to pay you enough for it to make the math work, you haven't found it.
Yeah.
Scale is a different question. So there's finding and there's scaling, and those are not the same.
Can you go into that further?
Sure. In the tech world, but I think it's more general. Ultimately, value creation comes from scale. You do something that can then reach lots of people, help lots of people, or things like that. And so a lot of times you see it in tech a lot where people will be really good at building something which is more or less a prototype. Okay, it's not well designed from a scale point of view. Things will break when you start adding more users. They don't think of security. So there's a set of things you have to think about when you go from initial product market fit, if you will, a prototype. Did this work? I have an idea. Does it resonate? To scale? And where most businesses ultimately fail, if they found some amount of product market fit, is in scaling. How do you think about what you have to put in place? It's like a building, the number of, if you go out and say, I'm looking for a contractor to help me, the contractor that can help you build, a house is different than the contractor that's going to help you build a 50-story building. It's the skill set is completely different. And so a lot of times I think, and one of the things I took away from being in big companies is big companies have to think that way. They think about, all right, what we're building needs to be able to scale. So they have a lot of the institutional knowledge and thinking about how to scale. Whereas most kind of entrepreneurs, that's not what you think of. And so, things break and then you create bad customer experiences. So there's really two parts. One of them is product market fit on the basics, and the other is product market fit at scale. I don't know if that
Yeah,
makes sense.
it does. It does. And I think that it also scaling with people and the right people at the right time is really important too,
Yes.
because the skill set of a founding AE versus a Series D AE is different, and it should be. But I think a lot of startups and I think a lot of founders, they don't think about that.
No,
Yeah.
they also don't. I think it's partially not think about it, and it's partially don't appreciate it's hard. Managing, leading people, and I think leading is more important than managing. Managing is important too, but you have to lead or people don't want to follow. And you have to manage or, you don't set up the processes. But that is again, that's another skill that you can get in big companies. One of the things that you can learn. So again, some companies may be good at this, some companies may be bad at it. But, I had the good fortune to work at some companies that are amazing at that, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, and the discipline in training people to lead and manage at scale, because the only way you can build something big, we'll see if it changes with AI, but for the most part is you have to be able to have people want to be there, want to work and be able to put themselves into it. And it's an underappreciated skill. And I think, as you said, a lot of times founders will bump into that. Some turn out to be good at it. You see a guy like Brian Chesky or Mark Zuckerberg that scaled, and you see other people. And again, other people that don't. Success back to the product market fit. It was really great that you brought that up. That's the other piece, is if you can't lead people at scale, you can't build a company at scale.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. I kind of want to talk about in the same vein as product market fit, product-led growth. I'm seeing so many more companies now offering some sort of freemium or self-service. And I think for some companies it works really well, but sometimes I'll go back and try to sign up for a self-service product and it's not there or it's changed or something. And I think that a lot of companies are struggling with actually creating a PLG motion that can scale and kind of figuring out like where it fits and like what problem they're actually solving and for who.
Yeah.
Do you have any opinions on that?
It's a really good point. I think the core premise of product-led growth is low acquisition costs. Okay. I mean, it all comes down to what's the lifetime value of a customer? What's my acquisition cost of a customer? What's the churn? So the idea of product-led growth is, hey, my product's going to be good enough that it leads to a very low cost of acquisition. Okay. So it's not a thing. All right. It's using your product to drive acquisition as opposed to other types of spending, referrals and other kinds of stuff, which doesn't make it not important, but it ultimately comes down to, what is it, how do you acquire people and how do you keep them? And I think the challenge, as you described, is there are so many ways of trying to do that. You see that in not just applications, you see it in games, have a different model. You see it now in Substacks and in podcasts. I mean, everybody is trying to figure out how I get people to try some version of trial at a low barrier and then go from there. And so one of the things is, unless the ultimate thing you're selling fits the thing we talked about earlier, unless ultimately the product that you're offering is one that people value, if you haven't found product market fit, then freemium doesn't matter, because ultimately people will churn out. And so I think ultimately the most important thing is to make sure that the product that you're building or the service that you're building has that fit from a price value point of view and a churn point of view. Because then you're like, okay, once I get people, I know I found a price point, I found a value proposition, and I'll keep them. Then what can what are the tools I can use to do that? But product-led growth, if people churn out, hasn't helped you. A bunch of people try, I mean, in a sense, a lot of people trying a free version may be terrible for you, because you got to build the infrastructure to support those people. If they have a bad experience in the free version, then they'll never sign up. It's so I do think that the challenge is ultimately more related to what's the product that you're offering, and if that works, then product-led growth is a tool. So that's, it's become, I think, an overused thing. Hey, we got to get product-led growth. Okay.
Yeah.
You want a low customer acquisition. The other thing is, how do we get a very low customer acquisition cost that leads to people that convert well and don't churn? Uh, Sometimes product-led growth might be it. I don't know. Sometimes there's all kinds of other models. The other, and again, the most effective version of this is gaming. Getting people, the free version of a game, and then it gets you addicted, and then you gotta, you've gotta subscribe to get more. I mean, games are the best way, I think, if you're gonna look at models to copy, and they're not all easily copyable, but games have probably perfected how do you tweak features to get somebody to go from free to paid. That, I think, is magic.
Interesting. I don't have too much gaming experience myself, but maybe I'll have to check it out.
No, but it's interesting. It was like the conversation that I mentioned earlier about the platform that we're using. We won't go by name, but there's um, in every business, you got to get to the point where there's a sweet spot of and then where do you try to sell? So my point about gaming was, and I don't know the exact statistic, but something like more than 90% of the money that is earned in app stores like Apple and Google is in-game spending. Huge amount. Yep, it's one of the reasons why they don't want to let people charge outside the ecosystem. The whole battle of Epic and Apple is, but I mean, it's worth, if you're if you're interested at all. I mean, you can go look and just kind of find out, what's the waterfall of money in app stores and how much of it goes to essentially product-led growth in games, which is people will try it and then upgrade, versus in other things. And so what I think you found is an alternative to product-led growth is figuring out ways in which your free version, it can be subsidized, which is why advertising works so well. Look at podcasts. The model for podcasts, you're either doing it because it's a lead generation for your business, or you're doing it, because you can get sponsors. So I think that's the other really interesting thing that's come along is how do you create, which is a different question, how do you create a revenue stream from the free version so that the entire process is not about conversion? Spotify did
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
Like, I think again, it took them a long time to be profitable because it's a challenged business model, but Spotify is actually okay if people stay on the ad-supported version. They'd like them to convert, but the ad-supported version can make money. I mean, look at Facebook. So there's a really interesting question of how, if you will, ad-supported fits into a product model. I don't have the answer, but that's the other thing I would think people, is got to look at, is where are those incremental features, and yeah, and what are you really accomplishing?
Yeah.
I
Yeah. I
don't know if
hadn't
that's
looked.
helpful, but it was
Yeah,
an
no, it
opinion.
is. It is. It is. I hadn't thought about it that way. Well, Anthony, last question for you. When you think of growth, and this might be a loaded question, but when you think of growth and you're maybe thinking about growth for your customers, how are you measuring it? Like, well, how do you think about it? And then how do you measure it? And when I say, how do you think about it? Do you think about it in revenue targets? Do you think about it in product releases? Like if it's a product-led growth company, like number of users? Do you think about funding stages? And then how do you measure success in achieving those goals?
So look, in the simplest sense, all that ever really matters is cash flow. All right. I mean, Jeff Bezos at one point said the way to value Amazon is, free cash flow from customers. His goal is to continue to increase free cash flow from customers because cash flow is all you got. So all those other metrics are depends on the again, this is depends. If it's a business, if it's not a business, if there are other things where, cash flow is a thing but not the thing. If you're in a philanthropic, if you're in a nonprofit, you have impact and all that stuff. But I think ultimately for anyone that's in a business, if you're not generating positive cash flow, you don't stay alive, and which doesn't let you do all those things. So I didn't say it's the only thing that mattered, but I said it's foundationally. I think you got to start there, and then the question is, what are the other goods, social goods or value goods that you're trying to create. So yeah, then the different help customers you help. There's all kinds of other metrics which depend on the business, but ultimately, if it's not cash flow positive, and that's the other thing is cash flow. Cash flow is what matters. But you got to be careful about various forms of profit manipulation, which is why cash is cash. So I don't know if,
That's
again, I don't know, just that's a pretty bottom line view, but it's not the only thing, but it enables everything. If you don't have a cash flow positive business, then you won't stay a business and you can't do whatever good thing you're trying to do.
Yeah. No, I love that because that's one of my favorite questions to ask people, and I've gotten so many different answers that it's really cool to see the way like different people think about it and also look at like their backgrounds and where they came from and where they are now. So you're the first person that's told me cash flow.
It's like, again, not because that's the most important thing in the world, but it's like this. If someone, if you look at your own personal life, you can have a lot of goals, but if you're not making enough to feed yourself, then a lot of those goals, kind of fall by the wayside. So the enabler of other higher order goals is, we live in a world where, financial things are what enables that stuff. So that's kind of why I started there. Personally, that's not my primary motivation in life, but it at all. But without that, you know,
Yeah.
can't do anything. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
True.
yeah.
True. Well, Anthony, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. If anyone wants to get in touch, how can they find you?
Sure. Best way is the website is Techquity, TECHQUITY.ai. I'm Abay, ABAY at techquity.ai. And I'm also on LinkedIn. I think it's Anthony. I think it's just Anthony Bay. So if you want to find me on any of those, that would be great.
Awesome. Hopefully someone will reach out.
Thank you so much for your time.
Likewise. Thank you.